Some of the problems we've seen with population declines in sage grouse. We've talked about problems we've seen with respect to habitat loss and deterioration, and Dr. Schroeder just gave a nice overview of how biologists at least keep tabs on sage grouse populations. Now what I think we'll do in the next couple of papers, at least I hope, is to talk about what we as professional biologists are trying to do to deal with the problem of declining sage grouse populations and declining sage grouse habitats, and hopefully successfully so to take us into the 21st century. Now, people have been, as you I think probably now aware, concerned about status of sage grouse really since the early 1900s. The first guidelines for managing the species habitat were actually published 1977, and they were at the time based on the best available information, and they were based largely on work done in the 50s and 60s. And hopefully this afternoon you realize that since the 70s and well into the 80s and 90s, we've done a lot more work on sage grouse in terms of understanding what makes the species tick, what increases or decreases populations, what some of the problems are. So we've made great strides since 1977. Since 1977 also, as people pointed out, we've still seen range-wide population decline, sometimes in excess, mostly in excess of 30%. Very few, if any, stable to increasing populations over the long term. We've seen habitat degradation. We've seen wildfire play a major role. We've seen private rangeland being converted into agricultural uses. The 1977 guidelines were not very successful in allowing us to manage or conserve or perpetuate the species. So the folks that are involved with the Western States Sage and Columbian Sharp-tailed Grouse Workshop a few years ago decided that these guidelines, because of some of these problems, needed to be revisited, reworked, and updated. What I'm going to do now is talk about what we've done there, why we've made the changes that we have. As I said, over the years, since publication of the guidelines, we have still seen crested wheatgrass seedings being put in. Some people actually have the gall to tell you that that's a sufficient amount of sagebrush for a sage grouse. It is certainly not. But you know, we still have an educational hurdle to get over. We also see and hear people talk about habitat fragmentation and the loss of migration corridors and connectivity. What does that mean? Well, here's a nice example of what that means. This is a Landsat image of an important wintering and breeding habitat on the Upper Snake River Plain in Idaho. 1975, and although some of it apparently is cut off here, what I want you to see is that there are corridors here that allow birds wintering and breeding here to move this way, to move north, kind of northwest into mountain valleys. As we move into 85, you see these corridors starting to shut down. The red is agriculture, largely potato and alfalfa fields. The green is sagebrush steppe. The white is garbage. Sand dunes and some things like that. Totally unimportant to a grouse. Anyway, as we now move into the 90s, you can see that all of this has pretty well been closed down to two narrow little corridors, and in 1992, 93 actually, this area burned. It was burned by a wildfire, so we have no connectivity in terms of sagebrush-dominated rangeland allowing birds to migrate out. Those are just some of the problems that we're facing, folks, as we're trying to put together management guidelines, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. All right, I could go on and on about why we had to change or update the guidelines. I'm going to give you one example. And earlier, someone asked me about circles and dots on a map. That comment probably came from these management guidelines, and in particular, Guideline 3, which basically said the breeding complex will be considered as all lands in 3-kilometer radius of an occupied lek or group of leks. And then we said control of vegetation within this breeding complex should not be undertaken. At the time the guideline was published, it was widely embraced. People liked it. They could run to a map. They could put a dot on the map. They could draw a circle around the dot and say, hey, hands off, and feel pretty good about it. We can protect this area and not worry about the other stuff. Well, a couple of things happened once the circles and dots went onto a map. Some of us found ourselves in the embarrassing position of trying to make a claim that crested wheatgrass seedlings that might fall within that circle were nesting habitat, when in fact they were not. We also saw things like rocky outcrops, basalt outcrops and things appearing within those areas. And we knew that this was not being a very useful definition, but still it allowed us to put our dots and circles on a piece of paper and at least theoretically feel pretty good about what we're doing. And nobody critically addressed this issue until the late 80s. And one of our graduate students, as part of his master's work, looked at the distribution of sage-grouse hens and nesting hens and leks and basically and looked at it in terms of how they related to that particular guideline. Did the guideline work or not? Did it fit or not? And basically, Wayne Walkenen pointed out that guideline assumes that all areas, within that 3-kilometer circle are important. That's an inherent assumption, which we quickly realized is wrong. Wayne also pointed out that sage-grouse do not select nest sites based solely on distances. They don't go out 3 kilometers and say, oops, I can't go any further, because that's what the guideline says. It doesn't happen. All right. We found out that the guideline offered essentially the same protection for random points as it did for nest sites in our study area. And finally, found no evidence that a lek is part of a breeding complex that includes a surrounding nesting area. What we're getting at here is that the habitat is not, the nesting habitat that I talked about earlier, is not uniformly distributed around a given lek. Instead, it's irregularly distributed, and they extend out for 4, 5, 6, or 8, or 10, or up to 20 kilometers or more. We've had instances where some sage-grouse may go 10, 15, or 20 miles or more to select a nest site. Okay, so obviously when we published this, that pretty well shot that guideline in the foot and urged all of us to revisit these guidelines and try to come up with something that, from a biological and a conservation standpoint, was more meaningful. All right, so we have revised the guidelines and we have broadened them. And one of the first things we do is try to give people a sense of what kind of critter they're dealing with. They're not dealing with a pheasant, they're not dealing with a quail, they're dealing with something that tends to have a long life and a low reproductive rate unless they live in Washington. Okay? All right. Also, we point out that not all sage-grouse populations are the same, and that in fact populations can be defined based on their migratory behavior. We have one-stage migratory populations. These are birds that actually migrate between 2 distinct seasonal ranges, a summer range and a combined winter and breeding habitat. And these habitats may be 10, 20, or 30 miles or more apart. We have 2-stage migratory populations. These birds use 3 distinct seasonal ranges, a winter range, a breeding habitat, and a summer range. We're talking about annual movements that are going to exceed 80 to 100 kilometers. And we do have non-migratory populations, relatively few in Idaho so far as we know. They seem to be more common in parts of Montana and Wyoming. Before our managers can make intelligent decisions about what they have to do in order to protect these various habitats, they have to know what they're working with, okay? So we urge people, first of all, find out what you're dealing with. What kind of critter are you dealing with? And as Dr. Braun pointed out earlier, to even complicate matters more, now we have a new species of sage-grouse that does some things even differently. Okay. The guidelines themselves are now broken down into a population section and a habitat section. And Dr. Schroeder already talked about our monitoring programs, and we talk about those in the guidelines, give people an idea of what they can do and why they should do it in terms of assessing breeding populations and how they might assess production if they think that's necessary. And then the heart of it, habitat guidelines. What do we need, folks, and how do we get there? And here we're talking about, first of all, and this should come as no surprise given my earlier remarks, they're broken apart by season. And within breeding habitats, we suggest a 15 to 25% canopy coverage of sagebrush. okay? An average height of 18 centimeters or better in terms of forbs and grasses. We're still working on a sort of a density or canopy coverage fudge factor here for forbs and grasses, and that should be a 15 centimeter visual obstruction rating for people that like to use real bell poles. Again, we're trying to protect the sagebrush overstory, and I think as somebody indicated earlier, you can have too much sagebrush. 30, 40, 50% canopy cover of sagebrush is too much of a good thing. I don't think you can have too many forbs and grasses as long as you have good sagebrush cover. And we urge no sagebrush control, but we're putting now the onus on the habitat manager, the biologist, to get out and, first of all, identify where the leks are, and then, using Landsat imagery, using field text searching techniques, radio telemetry, whatever tools he might be able to afford, figure out where his breeding habitats or her breeding habitats are with respect to those leks. Don't put a dot and a circle on a map and call it good, because it's not going to do you any good in the long run.
How about on that last one where the no sagebrush control? How about like mowing, where you're just taking off part of it, where you're releasing it to come back and you get more forbs back?
I'll get to that. Yeah, I'll get to that, because there is a difference, and we understand that there are places where, because of years and years and years of certain land use treatments, we have basically lost our understory. The question is, how can we recover the understory without sacrificing that overstory, especially if that overstory provides critical winter range as well? There's no easy answer to that. I can guarantee you won't do it by just going out and burning 100,000 acres. Okay? But you're right. You may be able to use interseeding techniques, small patch burns. We're not precluding any of that in terms of habitat, in terms of rangeland rehabilitation to fix a broken system. We don't want a system in good shape messed with. Okay? Summer range managers have a lot more leeway here. We point out that the birds are interested in forb-rich areas. We also point out that pesticides have been identified as a problem for sage-grouse and have caused direct mortality as a result of exposure to sage-grouse. We talk about that a little bit, and also talk about the development of water sources for grouse. Lots of people have done this as kind of a feel-good measure. Biologists still oftentimes are looking at sage-grouse during the spring. They see them on leks, so guess where they're going to put the water? Where they see sage-grouse in the spring. Come August, guess where the grouse are? 20, 30 kilometers away. We're not going to use these things. So if you want to put in water developments, which sage-grouse will use, you put them in or adjacent to summer range or along migration routes. Avoid sagebrush control, as Sam Stiver already pointed out, in areas that are going to provide escape cover for sage-grouse and loafing cover next to wet meadows and riparian areas and so forth. That doesn't mean that you can't go in at 8,000 feet. I showed a picture earlier of a nice open meadow. That was created by a fire. That was at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. Great for sage-grouse summer range. We can do those kinds of things. Okay. And finally, winter, back to another critical stage for sage-grouse. During winter, sage-grouse need access to sagebrush under all snow conditions. So we need a diversity over a large area. I'm not talking about 100 acres here. I'm talking about hundreds of square miles. But a diversity of height and canopy coverage classes of sagebrush that would allow sage-grouse access under all conditions to 10 to 25% canopy cover of sagebrush, and sagebrush that sticks up 25 to 30 centimeters above the snow. Again, avoiding sagebrush control in these areas, but understanding that there are some areas where we've lost the understory that are both winter and nesting habitat, and there we have to talk about rehabilitating those rangelands, and some rangeland manipulation techniques may be appropriate. Okay, and finally, last but certainly not least, we have asked each state and province to put together their own conservation strategy, understanding full well that a Gunnison sage-grouse is different than a sage-grouse in Idaho on the Upper Snake, that is different from a sage-grouse, at least to some degree, in Washington. So we want each state and province to develop their own conservation plan using local working groups to get at and hopefully to do what we're doing in this room, to get some cooperation. okay, and input from people on a local basis. Give them ownership in what we're trying to do. We need to inventory our remaining habitats. Folks, we don't even know what we've got left, let alone what shape it's in most cases. That's an important point that needs to be taken care of right away. How do we protect what's left? In some cases, fire suppression is a very appropriate sort of thing to do, especially in Wyoming habitat, Wyoming ensis habitat. And finally, and I'll talk about this in a little while again, we need to figure out how to improve these degraded areas. How do we reclaim a stand of cheatgrass? How do we go in and enhance or improve an understory in a sagebrush stand without totally messing up that sagebrush stand? Those are kinds of things in terms of we'll have a what we need to know section. We'll talk a little more about that. Okay, with that, Mark, if I have any time, I'll take questions.
Just a couple of them.
Yes?
Dr. Connelly, I had a question. Last September, I was out at the Cliff allotment. I'm sure everybody knows where that is in Idaho, in the Body Resource area. And selling the cliff in the Vail District is an allotment called the Whiteworth allotment. I don't know if you've been out there. It's the left-hand side of the road as you're going out to Three Forks to the hot springs. That's the Whiteworth.
They only let me out of eastern Idaho twice a year.
It's quite a ways away from the Whiteworth. It's not related to that. It's just the name of this allotment. And it's beautiful stands of sage, but absolutely nothing underneath is growing. And I asked when was the turnout for this allotment, and they said it's early spring. And I could still see, almost like dinosaur prints from millions of years ago, the squished up mud that was still left there, and nothing was going to grow there. So it seems like that is a real problem as far as not allowing anything to grow there because of the timing of the turnout of the cows is so destructive to those plants. There was just sagebrush. So they're here in the Vail District. Let's burn it.
Yeah, well, and then that won't solve the problem. But I've got some friends that ranch in our area, and they have voiced frustration over the same sort of situation, that they inherited an allotment that had nothing under it, and their question to me is, how do I fix it? And I don't have a good answer for them right now. It's one of these things that it's in bad shape. Our task as a group is to try to figure out how to fix it, taking into consideration the different folks that are involved. And yeah, just going in and lighting a match to it. You don't have anything there to work with. So, but you may have other alternatives, and some of the local ranchers will be able to provide, they can tell you, hey, I can live with this, I can't live with this, these are my alternatives. You've got to be talking to those people as well. Who else? Yes?
Well, sometimes you've got situations where you've got lots of understory because of overgrazing, and it could be, in some places it's elk as much as it's
That's right.
cattle. And other times, a lot of the loss of understory is simply because of density of sagebrush. Because the plant succession, the stands are old, sagebrush takes an incredible amount of water out of the ground at times, and on certain sites, there's not a whole lot you can do. You're not going to be able to restore the herbaceous understory unless you somehow reduce the density of sagebrush, because there's no water.
That is an alternative, but if you don't have anything to work with, you see, then you're going to still have to talk about.
Well, that's exactly right. One of the things you have to decide, if you're talking about these overly dense stands of sagebrush, fire can be an option if there are residual understory plants that need to be released, and a lot of people don't take the time to figure that out. They say, well, we'll burn it. Well, are you going to burn it and then have to go in and reseed it?
Might have to.
Or are you going to or if you burn it in an appropriate fashion, do you have an opportunity for natural regeneration and release of existing plants, which can provide great brood-rearing habitat if done properly?
Well, we got a paper on that, and that's even though that's been an idea that's been pushed a number of times, that fire can enhance brood-rearing habitat in these early brood, it doesn't do it. But anyway, we've got time for one more, Mark?
Just a couple more, then we really should move on.
Alan?
It seems like we've been pushing you a little bit about getting guidelines out, and here they are in my slides, but we haven't seen.
Well, actually, the states are reviewing them right now. Actually, the deadline for the state's review is now over, and we're only waiting on one sand diver from Nevada to get back to us.
Why
Russ. I'll teach you.
I spend a fair amount of time out in the countryside, and it's quite evident one of the biggest problems we face out there is the lack of that understory in these areas that the birds are using. I understand the importance the fire has played in the past in the natural setting before and since sales. The problem seems to me that's developed on fires is that column-controlled burns seem to be a euphemism anymore. Because a lot of these controlled fires that get going don't really get going.
Sure.
And, you know, I think, as you mentioned, working with the local people, and people starting to get serious about this thing. We've been talking about it a long, long time. And we just got to put our heads together and figure out what can be done.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this again when we talk about information needs, and we'll talk about what we need to get as a group, what we can do, and where we really need to go with some of these things. Sure.
John's just waving.
Oh, okay.
I guess we should take one.
All right.
Jack, you didn't mention any management for summer habitat areas on riparian and wet meadows. There was no parameters. Maybe you have some and you just...
There's information actually in the guidelines. In this brief review, I didn't go into every little detail. But there are different options. You know, Sam likes to talk about the importance of wet meadows in Nevada, and the use of grazing to keep or to decrease the herbaceous cover to a certain height where sage grouse will come in. They won't come in and use meadows with grass that high. So if sage grouse are particularly of particular interest in an area, there may be some possibilities to use grazing to manipulate vegetation. We talk about, I think I mentioned the pesticides issue, and the fact that, you know, what we see happening, pesticides are not applied every year, or at least the bad ones aren't applied every year in southeastern Idaho. But when they are, they often are, their application coincides with drought years, so we already have a problem. And then these organophosphate and carbamate pesticides are applied. The grouse are in the alfalfa and the potato fields, and they get whacked. So we provide some information that, you know, an appropriate management technique might be to look for some alternatives here, folks, without, and of course that doesn't necessarily settle very well with some people, but a lot of farmers have said, hey, I don't want to use this stuff regardless. That's the feedback we get. So we do provide some of that information, but again, remember, there's a whole variety of summer ranges these birds are using. Everything from an irrigated lawn at the Idaho National Environmental Laboratory, you know, to a wet meadow in Nevada. And it's not a one-size-fits-all application.
Great, thank you. All right, Dr. Brian.